The banks can't trick you to sign away your birthright and your children's future. But they can go buy off your government, militarize your police and military generationally while they get the wealth of the control they have in the earlier sets of the Ponzi scheme, and then come in and bring total tyranny in. And this is what they have done. So this is not a bailout you're seeing. This is a mass raping of the economy. This is done by design, and they are moving in army brigades so that when you really find out what's happened and when you riot because they've taken your pension fund and destroyed your future, they can use microwave guns and machine guns to gun you down the street. Now, the good news is most of the military and police I talk to are now aware of this because of people like Jim Marrs and myself and others who've been out there warning people, and so they're not going to go along with it. I wish this wasn't the truth, but it's really happening. Now, it's been said many different ways by many different historians and people of note, philosophers, that those that do not know history are doomed to repeat it. And if one wants to understand the present and the future, they need to have a grasp of history, because humans tend to act the same. There's nothing new under the sun. The same scams get developed, the same ideas, the same mindsets. And if you study the Nazis and you study fascism in Italy and Germany, and if you learn who the players were in the United States, England, and Germany who funded the fascist and the communist, and when you read books by Carroll Quigley, the top Georgetown professor, Bill Clinton's mentor, he explains in a 900-page book how the big banks funded the fascist and the communist. They create a dialectic. They control the left, right, and then you think you have a choice, but it's a controlled choice. But they're going with the fascist model right now. They brought down the communist model in 91. That got them, some control. And now, and domesticated the population. Now they're going with the fascist model. Now, don't think of it as a guy with a mustache. I have a picture here I drew on the front of Newsweek. What Bush got right, and I drew a little mustache on him. And, we can joke about that all day, but he is just a puppet. But his grandfather was the head U.S. Nazi in the United States, and that was even in the New York Times. It was in the New York Times 50-something years ago. And so Jim Marrs, best-selling author, again, as I mentioned earlier, he wrote the book that was turned into the film JFK, helped write the screenplay, and was the main consultant on that film. His new book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, is a New York Times bestseller, available everywhere, and as well at Infowars.com, along with a film I made 4 years ago about the same subject, but he's got into 100 times more detail, and it is shocking. And so when the Nazis were brought to the U.S., when Germany fell, they were coming back home. They were coming from where they sprung. And that's why they were put in charge of not just NASA, but every other major agency. And so now you'll understand what's really happening. For the rest of the show, Jim, you've got the floor. I'll be throwing a few questions out, but start at the beginning for us.
Well, actually, you could probably go back into the 1800s and to the Rothschild mode of banking, where they pitted the European nations against each other for profit and control. But let's just go to the Russian Revolution of 1917. When that happened, Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States at the time, wrote that the bulk of financial aid to Russia at that time did not go to the Democratic Kerensky government. It went to the Bolsheviks, who became the communist. So we created the communist, or Wall Street bankers and Bank of England bankers, created the communist in 1917. Lenin was not even in Russia. He was in Switzerland. He was aided in passing through wartime Germany with German intelligence and a German banker, including Max Warburg. The reason Max Warburg is interesting is because his brother
started the Federal Reserve.
Paul Warburg had come over here, had participated in the conspiracy of Jekyll Island, had created the Federal Reserve System, and was head of the Federal Reserve System at the time of World War I, and in fact was in charge of funding the war effort for the United States in World War I, while his brother is funding the German war effort, to show you how they play both sides.
Now, hundreds of books have been written about this. It's mainline history. It's now declassified. The U.S. government put Mao in. But a lot of leftists are going, what do you mean the bankers funded the communists? Explain that to them.
Well, they sent the aid to Lenin, and whoever pays you money controls it. The philosophical leader of the communism was Leon Trotsky, and in 1917 he was living on Rockefeller land and working in New York. But they put him on a boat with about $20 million, $40 million raised from Wall Street capitalists, including the Schiffs, and 300 revolutionaries, and they sent him off to Russia. Now, the Canadian authorities stopped him at Halifax and said, "We've heard your speeches. We know you're going over into Russia and take it over and create a communist government, and you're going to pull Russia out of the war. That's going to free 1 million soldiers to come over and fight our good Canadian boys in the West, so we're not going to let you go." So, but he got loose. How? Because Winston Churchill, who was our Admiralty, Lord of the Admiralty at the time, said, "No, you need to let him go." And Woodrow Wilson, through his mentor, Colonel House, gave him an American passport. And so Trotsky was released, sent to Russia, and along with Lenin, created communism in Russia. Now, Alex, I think the game plan was they were going to create a socialist East, and they were going to pit it against a capitalist West for what we came to know as the Cold War. And they were going to pit these two blocs against each other. But what happened is that the communists created the Internationale, and they said, "Workers of the world, unite." And they said they created very powerful communist parties in Italy, France, Germany, Britain, the United States. So these capitalists were going, wait a minute, we don't want this. If it becomes one world socialism, then we can't play off one nation against another or one bloc against another. So they decided they had to stop the spread of communism. And so to achieve that, they reached into Germany, the one country in the middle of Europe that was in a position to stop the not only the theological but the military spread of communism. And they found a German army intelligence agent who they funded and helped create the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And, of course, that was Adolf Hitler. And you got to remember that the Nazi is an acronym for National Socialist. And National Socialists are really no different than Communist Socialists, the only difference being that you could confine them within one national boundary. You could keep it within Germany. You could keep it within Italy. That way, these bankers could continue to play off one country off against another. And so that was led up to World War II.
All right, we got a break. We're going to come back and get into this. And for those that don't know, that's mainline history. That the Nazi Party was founded and run by German intelligence, funded by British intelligence and Lord Milner's group. So the whole thing was run out of Britain. We're going to get to that later, that Britain right up into the war was running Germany. We'll be right back. Okay, we've got the author of The Rise of the Fourth Reich, Jim Marrs, with us. Now, it's common knowledge that the U.S. and England funded Hitler. But he was like a rock star. I mean, he was all over the newsreels, all over radio. My grandfather remembers growing up in Dallas, and he was like in the newspapers on radio, what a great guy he was, right up until 1939 or so. Jim Marrs continued, because this then connects into today. And this isn't like, oh, there's a few Nazis in the government. This is the governing system. The Nazi symbols are in the Senate, the fasci. It's how the government's being run, the black uniforms, the national police force, the homeland. That's what Hitler called it, was the Reichland, which means homeland. Jim Marrs, please continue.
Well, let me just preface by quickly pointing out to everyone that's listening that when we say fascist and Nazis are taking over in the United States, we're not talking about goose-stepping Germans. No, the Germans lost the war. We're talking about the National Socialist that funded the Nazis, put them in power, kept them in power, and then brought them over here after the war. I've already rattled off some of the corporations that were supporting the Nazis prior to the war. Brown Brother Harriman's, the JF, IBM. IBM produced very specialized punch cards for the German IBM equipment that allowed them to ship all the Jews and the dissidents off to the concentration camps. General Motors, Ford, they were producing war materials for the Nazis because business, after all, is just business. But I also want to point out, in fact,
our bombers weren't allowed to bomb those GM and Ford plants.
That's right.
I read turning off Panzers.
I read an account of a German worker, I think, at the General Motors plant, and he said that when they had a bombing raid, everybody would run to the General Motors plant because they knew it was safe. In 1936, Time magazine referred to Schroeder, Rockefeller and Company as investment bankers as the economic booster of the Rome-Berlin axis. And their attorneys were two fellows from the New York law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles' mentor was John J. McCloy, chairman of City National Bank, which is now Citicorp, and John J. McCloy sat with Hitler in his box at the 1936 Berlin Olympics.
And those guys go on to be the CIA director and then they're tied into the assassination of Kennedy.
Right. After the war,
lay it out. Take your time.
After the war, John J. McCloy gets to be the High Commissioner of Germany, and he pardons about 100,000 Nazis and sends them over to the United States. His protege, Allen Dulles, was the longest-serving CIA director, and through the CIA and through Operation Paperclip, which went under the radar of Presidents Eisenhower and Truman, they were never made fully aware of what they were really doing. They altered and whitewashed the backgrounds of thousands of these Nazis, changing it from ardent Nazi to not an ardent Nazi, and rolled them into the CIA. And then on top of that, we had the Gehlen organization, which was General Reinhard Gehlen, a Nazi, who was providing us all of our early intelligence data.